It's like cold, black and thunder. The fleet has left while the admiral slumbered. Vigilante nocturnal, test the chains and all the screws. We are many, they are few.
I want to welcome you all here to Labor Fest panel that we're having. There's been a long history of environmental and toxic crises that working people and communities are facing. And tonight's panelists are going to be talking about the struggle to defend health and safety, and not only in the Bay Area, but in East Palestine. And Labor Fest is focused on working people, the struggle of working people, the fight for justice, environmental justice, and the fight to protect workers' health and safety, and also the fight to protect whistleblowers who speak out to protect health and safety. And all too many times, in fact, many times, whistleblowers, both in community and in unions and workers, get retaliated against for blowing the whistle on these toxic dump sites. And the latest major catastrophe in the United States has been the railroad wreck at Norfolk Southern in East Palestine. And our guests tonight are Ashley Gjøvik. She's a Apple Senior Engineer Manager, OSHA EPA whistleblower in Silicon Valley, where she worked in an Apple office. Stella Miranda, who's the wife of an AFSCME 3299 worker at Hunters Point. Dr. Ray Tomkins, historian, scientist, and health and safety expert, who spent his life trying to protect health and safety, doing the best he can at Hunters Point Shipyard, which is a radioactive dump. And Matthew Weaver, who's a railroad carpenter with IBT, Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division, and the elected legislative director of BMWD in the state of Ohio. He is also with Railroad Workers United. So welcome all of you to our meeting tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
great, glad you could all be here. So I wanted to start with go east because Brother Matt has to go to work tomorrow. Matt, why don't you take this off and begin the discussion of the lessons and the experiences of East Palestine?
So it's pretty interesting. I mean, I live near just east of Toledo, Ohio. So East Palestine's an hour and a half away from my house. Family's over near Cleveland, Akron, Canton. But most recently, just before the derailment, I worked in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, painting the crew offices, so it really hits home. I don't work for Norfolk Southern. I won't say who I work for because whistleblower retaliation is alive and well in the rail industry. But I hired in 1994, and I've been vocal and active in legislative issues and with the union. And it really has struck a chord with me that they had track maintenance guys in simple leather boots and leather gloves and jeans working on this derailment immediately. And they were not concerned about the safety of the workers. And that really hits home for me. So there was a town hall that Erin Brockovich had, and she made time right after it to have a discussion with me and then the attorney representing the people in the class action lawsuit. But I found that good communication and networking is powerful. So I find myself often saying, if something like this comes up, I just can't say no, because the people need to know what's going on. And like you and I talked about before the call, Steve, I believe that the EPA just handed the reins to Norfolk Southern. And it's very disgusting in my mind to think that they torched all those chemicals, burned them off when they had already collected them in a sealed, a lined containment ditch. So yeah, I don't think there was any reason for that. And it's hard to get answers on that because everyone wants to point the finger at each other on that. So it's, I'm here for questions, Q&A in that, but I don't have a lot of insight.
Maybe you can talk about this accident, because it seems like we're having real accidents every day. And I know Railroad Workers United, which is a United Craft organization, has been fighting to protect the railroad workers and communities who are affected by this. It doesn't seem that anything's really changed with all these wrecks. I mean, it's that these companies still get away with it. There's been no criminal prosecution. In
Right.
fact, there's been no real oversight of what happens when you have a disaster, a man-made disaster, which could have been prevented. Could that have been prevented? And why aren't they prevented when they happen over and over again?
The NTSB said 100% preventable, quote unquote. So it could have been prevented. Going back to regulation, I mean, they have hot box detectors. Norfolk Southern had theirs tuned down, so it didn't alert the crew. It only made a note or an email or to the dispatcher. It wasn't hot enough until the third defect detector to alert the crew. There's so many aspects to this. I was not a big proponent of nationalizing the railroads. And I thought more, well, let's let the regulators enforce regulations that already exist. And they're just not doing it. So what choice do we have but to demand that the railroads, just like in World War I, you nationalize the railroads and make them, they serve the public. They have what's the status called? It's right at the tip of my tongue, but they have common carrier benefits, but they certainly only serve their shareholders. And it rings true all the time. It used to be precision scheduled railroading, do more with less. Now it's do less with less. Freight is down, profit margins are down. On my railroad since Thursday night, right in my backyard, 8 miles away, we've had 5 derailments. Today it was 2 locomotives on the ground in the yard.
And this is just in the last couple of days.
This is since Thursday night. Yeah.
Sounds like a national emergency.
They don't exactly get the news involved so much. I made a call to the news today, but we'll have to talk about that tomorrow, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. And the issue of health care, I know that there were railroad workers who were sickened as a result of the toxic. Maybe you can talk about that. And also the community in East Palestine who have been forced to go back to their homes. They don't have enough money, and they're also still dependent on private health care or Norfolk Southern taking care of their health care. What do you think about this whole healthcare situation?
Yes, sir. Norfolk Southern started to blame other entities. I just was looking at an article that said Norfolk Southern sues 7 other companies for trying to spread the blame out. You know how that works. It's all about tort reform in America. And how do they not say the buck stops here and we can do better? But American capitalism, unregulated capitalism, is grossly vested in profit margins and the shareholders, and we, the working class and the general public, society suffers because of that.
And the issue of whistleblowers, I know there was an article in these times about the fact that railroad workers who do speak up to protect health and safety are retaliated against. Is that the case?
It is. Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 20109. I've had a case. I can only say it's been resolved. That's what I'm allowed to say. After my dismissal, I was dismissed for 393 days back in 2013. But yeah, whistleblower retaliation, specifically with the rail industry, has come to the front burner. Rick and Klima, our director of safety in the late 90s and early 2000s, worked to take it away from the FRA because the FRA was full of former railroad managers, and now it's an OSHA issue. So it's very interesting. I know so much about this that it's all about the Q&A and how do I get the right info to you, because I could go on forever on my soapbox.
And in Ohio, it seems that you have a lot of toxic dumps. You have radioactive waste dumps all over Ohio. It seems like it's an environmental catastrophe for a large number of working class communities in Ohio. Is that the case?
Davis-Besse is close to my house. I used to be a janitor there. My dad worked at Toledo Edison, Davis-Besse. Their containment is pretty secure. I'm not too worried. I can see the steam from the nuclear power plant from my home. I'm not too concerned about leakage, but I just don't think they've changed what they want to do and bury it or, contain it. They just don't come to a clear-cut decision. And it seems like by administration, then they change everything. Every administration ebbs and flows of how law goes,
And Mike Devine, the governor of Ohio, what has he done or not done? I know the community activists have been calling and urging him. They've had rallies to declare an emergency, a disaster. What has the governor done in Ohio?
DeWine, very early in the game, when Biden offered national assistance, said, "Oh, we don't need it," and then he was convinced to change his mind a few days later. But he seems to be caught up in the corporate mantra of letting the business run the show instead of having our public servants run the show and make the business serve society. I mean, all these corporations are chartered, and it seems like it all boils down to profit margins over people, profit over people.
And your organization, Railroad Workers United, your union, you're the legislative representative. What are you fighting for, and what are you urging working people to do and Americans to do to protect the health and safety of railroad workers and communities?
So Railroad Workers United, I was a founding member back in 2008. Ron Kamenko, Ed Michael, quite a few of brothers from other crafts. It's like a cross-craft caucus. So it's not a union, but it's just communication. We've got thousands of members, and talking to, how do the guys in the trains know what our guys on the ground do? How do the mechanical guys in the shops? You have to have some venue to talk to each other. Railroad Workers United is moving forward with the nationalization of the railroads. And I can't disagree that something's got to be done, because what's going on now, I believe after World War I, we had 2.5 million members of rail labor. Now, I think in the last round of bargaining, we had 117,000. So there's not enough people to do the work. So in the instance of the East Palestine issue, their car inspections are rushed. That could have been one of the issues. There was a hot box, a hot journal burned up. So the friction, the heat is what derailed that train. So there's many, many issues, but if you don't have one general venue to discuss this, then things get lost in the sauce,
And the Democrats in Ohio, there's some, the senator, have they called for any kind of criminal investigation, criminal prosecution of Norfolk Southern?
I haven't heard a whole lot of criminal prosecution. I've seen people asking for fines and that kind of stuff. The new Republican senator looked like he was going to play hardball right in the beginning of this, but then he backpedaled after perhaps the railroad lobbyists got to his office. I had great luck with Senator Portman on the REEF Act, the sequester of railroaders' sick pay and unemployment. But Portman retired, and Vance seems to be a corporate shill, I guess. And I guess that may be a little strong, but we'll see how his votes go and what happens from there.
And also, I understand that under federal law, the federal government could declare a national emergency in East Palestine and provide health care for all people who were affected by that disaster. If that's the case, why hasn't it been raised by the labor movement and the community demanding that President Biden call it an emergency, which it is and still is, and allow people to get health care? Because it seems like they're still dependent on private health care, that many people can't afford health care.
Right.
I mean, it's a horrifying situation.
Well, that was where the BMWD had done a study on healthcare, single payer healthcare, looked at like a 357 plan for the last round of negotiations to save the railroads and the workers quite a bit of money. But since other crafts had already accepted an agreement, the government shoved that agreement down our throats. It does seem like Congress and even President Biden aren't stepping up. The pro-labor, pro-rail labor president, I I'm interested to see what happens with UPS because I'm a little bit disappointed. I didn't criticize him too much, but I did criticize him because I voted no because we didn't get sick days. You know, who doesn't get sick days when you work outside every day?
Well, the whole Congress, Democrats, Republicans voted for that, including Bernie Sanders, voted to send for an agreement that didn't provide sick days. How is that possible that they would vote for an agreement that doesn't provide sick days when they know about precision, staffing? They know that you're understaffed, that workers have died because they haven't gone to doctors, because they're afraid of going to doctors for fear of being retaliated. I mean, it seems like a horrendous and deadly situation for railroad workers.
Especially in the time of a COVID pandemic. I mean, I had talked to guys in Roanoke, Virginia, where one guy came in sick because he had no sick days, he had no more time off, and he got everyone sick. So they had to have the system production gangs, big gangs, come in to do just simple section work. I think that Congress was had their feathers ruffled by the shippers. So during the STB hearings, the shippers were on rail labor side saying you need to hire more people, you need to serve your customers, and our spokesman said that the railroads were demarketing, going the opposite of capitalism to only chase high profit margin freight with less people. I mean, precision schedule rating, PSR, has cut tremendous amounts, like 30% of rail labor. How can you get the work done? I mean, we have trouble right now having derailment services getting the track back in service. Bridge, I say it's band-aids on broken legs. They wait till something's broken to fix it. Preventative maintenance is often out the window in the rail industry.
And you're continuing this fight. You're speaking out, as are other railroad workers. And what about the Teamsters Union, Sean O'Brien? Have any of the unions taken up these demands nationally? For example, nationalization of railway workers. I mean, you have
not nationalization, but the TTD, Transportation Division. I'm sorry, at a loss, but Reagan and the TTD was the umbrella over all of rail labor. So that's my big goal. That's RW has made me the chairman of a single bargaining coalition for the next round of bargaining, which begins at the end of next year. So our Section 6 notices are what you want to bargain, how do you expect changes, that kind of stuff. And then January 1st, the contract is bargained again. But the Railway Labor Act is a very different animal than the National Labor Relations Act.
And were you shocked about the corporate capture of these agencies, which are supposed to be set up to regulate the industry and protect communities and workers?
Most definitely. I'm very disappointed that seeing those chemicals getting burned off when I can see I did a hazmat derailment training, and how to identify the placards and what chemicals are in these tankers, and seeing them just say, oh, it's best to burn it off. It seems like some corporate pressure, and the EPA should have stepped in and talked about it more, because once they drained those off, the tanks weren't under pressure and they had time to make some better decisions.
Well, it sounds like they wanted to get the railroad going. That was one of the reasons they did that. Was that the reason that they did that?
Yes, they had the evacuation and they couldn't get the railroad running until the evacuation order was dropped. And I have heard, I can't confirm, that they told the people go back home, and within 8 minutes, the trains were running.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much. And if you can stay as long as you can, I know you have to get ready for tomorrow, another day. But anyway, thanks for joining us on this important discussion. And our next speaker from Silicon Valley is Ashley Gjøvik. And the computer industry, when it came to California, said it was a clean industry. Everything was going to be fine and people were going to be safe. They weren't going to have the toxins and the dangerous chemicals you have in the Midwest and other industrial centers. But I think people have discovered that actually these computer companies and processing companies are actually highly toxic. And Ashley was a manager at Apple and discovered, to her great shock, that she was being contaminated and her health was in danger. So welcome, Ashley, to our program.
Thank you for having me to be part of this. And thank you, Matt, everything you've been doing with the railway. Thank you so much for fighting that fight. Each of these is like its own battle, its own world. I think the most interesting thing for me about Silicon Valley was it's actually been known since the 80s just how toxic this stuff is in Silicon Valley, how contaminated, how polluted, the danger to workers, the danger to residents, the contamination of drinking water. And the most amazing thing to me is how somehow industry got everyone to forget. I go in and I discover what's been known for 50 years. And I'm just kind of shocked that everyone knows it's a problem and the government has been very willing to look the other way. And it's still hurting residents. It's still hurting tenants. We knew what to do and they're continuing to not do it.
So maybe you can talk about how you discovered not only the health hazard at where you worked, but also in your apartment and the connection and your long struggle to get protection for yourself and your coworkers and your neighbors. I
really unintentionally went on a tour of all of the hazardous waste issues in Silicon Valley. I saw a little bit of everything, and I did not mean to. So I moved into a brand new apartment in 2020. There were these beautiful like luxury apartments, and you would have never guessed they were built on a bunch of toxic waste. So there was a state cleanup site, a brownfield, and then there was a Superfund plume. So those are the federal cleanup sites that are really dangerous. It had a plume on the property too. They just built all these apartments. And I move in and I get really sick immediately. Like I'm fainting, I'm having chest pains, I'm in the emergency room. I get really sick, go on disability. We're trying to figure out what's wrong with me. I'd find out in September of 2020 that there's, for some reason, solvent vapors in my apartment that should not be there that were causing my injuries. And I wouldn't find out until this year. That's when I start learning about these cleanup sites, that you can have all this contamination in the soil and the groundwater from these companies that dumped or spilled or who knows what, and they can evaporate into your home, into your workplace and make you sick. And then this year I learned that my employer was operating a secret semiconductor manufacturing plant right outside our windows, forgot to change their charcoal for like 6 years. So we're like venting unabated industrial chemicals and solvents just into our windows and at an open air playground. So I'm dealing with that one now. And it's kind of interesting. So I was like, oh, this is a whole new set of laws too, and it's actually the government. I've been encouraged that they're much more responsive comparatively to the cleanup sites, assumably because it's like active pollution. So the more pollution that occurs as it's pouring out will be more cleanup later, and they want to avoid that. So they'll be a little more responsive. But all that happens, and I learned about these cleanup sites. And then my office, my Apple office, is on a triple Superfund site. So like 3 Superfund site groundwater plumes merge into one. And there's a long history of vapor intrusion at the site and around it, in communities and schools and houses and all this for like decades. But Apple never told us that it was a Superfund site. And when I started telling my coworkers, Apple got real upset and said they didn't want me talking to my coworkers about my safety concerns or telling them it was a Superfund site. So I got radicalized really quick because I had seen how sick this can make you, like overnight, just being exposed to this stuff. And I had moved out and my health returned within like a week. I was back to normal. So I could see, just how acute that exposure, how it can impact your whole life. So I had an experience with Apple in 2021 where I continued to raise concerns and ask questions about my office. And I learned that CERCLA is a Superfund law, and there's some requirements from the government of how they're supposed to clean it up and oversee it and inspect. And Apple is failing to do most of those things. And there were open issues they should have been addressing, like the number one plan to mitigate all that toxic waste in the ground into the building is to have a completely solid concrete slab on top, which is like very basic, right? Like you're kind of like, you'd laugh, you're like, that's it, just concrete on top. But like their concrete was cracked. Their concrete wasn't even solid. So there were these things where like, I don't have a background in any of this, but I have common sense. And as I learn some of this stuff and I'm just looking at them like, You haven't been paying attention. And then they were going to test the air, which was good to do the testing to see if we're exposed, but then they find the cracks and they're like, we're not going to test until after we fix everything to ensure our tests don't show that you were being exposed. So then I start learning about all these testing shenanigans. And I saw similar stuff with my apartment too, where I also was not getting the information that I felt like I deserved. And I was being told, like, as a tenant, I have no right to know if I'm being exposed. If it was real property, perhaps I'd have a right, but as a tenant, I don't. And then as an employee, they're telling me that I don't have a right to know with toxic waste like I would if it was solvents that we were using on purpose for work, because they're not testing, because they don't have proof that we're being exposed, because they're not testing. Therefore, they don't have to tell me. You know, it was all this stuff that was very jarring in the moment, because it just seems so reckless, and you have people's lives on the line. A lot of this is carcinogenic. You just make people very, very sick. And then, like, the most disturbing has been realizing that none of this was novel. Everything they were doing, everything I've found is just kind of the playbook for like decades and decades. And I think the very unique thing, though, for Silicon Valley is it still tried to do that thing where it wants to look clean and green. And now these companies also are doing these environmental social governance statements where they want to say they're sustainable and they're actually good for the planet, and saying all this crap that's completely a lie. If you go and look at their offices on these sites, right? Because not only are they on these toxic sites and they're not even trying to like contain it or help clean it up or protect their workers, but like Apple's semiconductor manufacturing plant, they were creating new pollution in 2023.
Well, maybe you can talk about the corporate takeover. We've talked about corporate capture of agencies in the railroads, and you had similar experience with EPA and the state government of California as far as protection. So maybe you can talk about your effort to get these agencies to defend you and other people and to do a proper investigation.
I was very naive going into this. I've been critical of the US government at times of imperialistic nature and capitalism, but I earnestly thought the government would like help if they heard an issue like any of this, of any of these environmental issues of safety. And then Apple, of course, was retaliating against me for raising the issues. So me raising the retaliation, I thought they would jump all over it. And the common theme with city, county, state, and federal government with Apple Computer has been like, the government is adversarial to me no matter what, and protective of Apple no matter what, which has just been so demoralizing. And I know this is a common theme with a lot of the big companies, railroads, like this is not unique to Apple, but Apple has a lot of money, has a lot of reach. They've hired a lot of politicians. Lisa Jackson, the previous head of the EPA, runs Apple's lobbying. So like they're pretty hooked in. And she was exerting her influence as we were going through this process. Through FOIA, I found that she's like trying to meet with the head of the EPA and trying to select the executive over the regional office that was overseeing the investigation into Apple. So like I'm seeing it play out in real time that they're just leaning into this. But it's also just kind of demoralizing. I learned the basics of how this stuff works. And I want to encourage anyone that watching this now or later that like, you don't have to have a degree in this stuff to learn the basics and ask intelligent questions and look at what's going on around you in your community and be able to flag issues. I think a lot of people can do that if you spend some time reading about it and learning about it. It's not rocket science. Again, it's like put concrete on top, make sure it doesn't crack is like the plan of record for the Superfund site. So if you learn about this stuff, you can go in and start like looking at what their plan was and what they're doing and pretty easily tell when it sounds like they're being, negligent, like they weren't doing inspections, they weren't testing, there's cracks, there's ways for that, like vapor intrusion exposure. And then going to the government, if your business, your bosses, your landlord, whoever aren't listening to feedback to do better, going to the government and pressing for them to say like, hey, like I know they're supposed to do this, they're not doing it. I think everyone should still try to do that because the government is supposed to actually enforce the statutes assigned to it. It's like supposed to happen. They're not though, like across the board. And my experience shows the whole range of the government capture and the government just giving up on enforcing their statutory obligations they're supposed to. of how was Apple ever approved to build and operate a semiconductor manufacturing plant 200 feet from 2,000 apartment windows. Like multiple government agencies had to know they were planning on doing that and shrugged it off. And when I got sick in 2020, I'm very loud about it. And like when I found out it was the brownfield and calling all these agencies being like, what is going on? A bunch of them must have known it was probably that factory and didn't tell me, didn't tell anyone. So like seeing when they're not stopping some of the stuff from happening, the US EPA was not paying attention to the Superfund site in my office. So it was able to go by for years and years without testing, without inspections, because the government was not asking them, what is the status of this site? They weren't, pushing them to do the stuff they're supposed to do. And then when you catch them, there's a whole nother like range of issues that the government will like show all this deference. With Apple, with my office, Apple's not a party to that Superfund site. It's north of Grumman. Apple's a tenant, but when I raised issues as a whistleblower to the US EPA, they immediately doxed me to my employer, telling them I was raising concerns, reached out to Apple to figure out how to respond to me. Meanwhile, like I'm raising concerns that Apple's like in violation of federal statutes, like obligations, right? So they're immediately just going to side with whatever the business is, try to keep the business happy. They will like not listen to feedback. I had to be a squeaky wheel for like 4 months to get the EPA to actually pay attention. And when they did, they found a cornucopia of open safety issues at that office. I did inspection. They're still trying to get them to do stuff. I was called Steve today. I had a new discovery from FOIA document. This is the only way I know what's going on too is public record requests and FOIA requests, because they won't tell me. No one will tell me what's going on, even if I'm like personally exposed. So I'm getting all, doing all these requests, trying to learn what's happening. And today it came back that in my office, so Apple was, when there was a cracks in the floor, Apple was refusing to test the air until they fixed the cracks. So there's no evidence gathered that we were exposed. And I was like upset about that when I was still an employee before I was fired, of like, I would like to know what I was exposed to. If I was exposed to anything, can you test before you fix it? And they're like, no. And then the EPA finds this issue with our HVAC where Apple did all this crazy stuff. So like our HVAC was shooting the Superfund gases into our faces inside the office. And the EPA had been telling Apple that they need to test the air before they fix it, so they know what the exposure was. FOIA documents came back today, and apparently Apple wore the US EPA down, and EPA approved that Apple could fix all possible routes for solvent exposure before they test the air. So it sounds like the test results came back great because they gave Apple 2 years to cover up all potential safety issues, which it might sound like not that important in the moment when you hear something like that. But if you imagine 5 years down the road, if someone's trying to understand why they got sick at a certain place or what was going on, the only thing in the formal government record is going to show that test results and it coming back fine. And it's not going to mention anything about all the open safety issues that they were allowed to fix before the test. So you would see that and think like, oh, there's never been an issue. So all of that kind of stuff the government does to help these businesses, it covers up their negligence from the beginning, their negligence ongoing, retaliation against employees who are trying to raise issues, community exposures. And I was realizing with my office, like it wasn't just me and my coworkers. These sites are big and a lot of people are impacted. What's happening at like the ground zero though is really important for the community, because if contamination is increasing, if there's issues, other people are impacted too. So it was also just kind of crazy to me the EPA was not using their community outreach teams, which they have and are supposedly required to engage with the community and inform them what's going on. But instead they were helping Apple try to keep everything quiet.
And as a result of your termination, illegal termination, you got the one agency to say that you'd been terminated illegally, but
Not yet.
not yet. I mean,
We're still
apparently
2 years.
this is 2 years after raising health and safety complaints.
Yeah, the NLRB came out and agreed with me that Apple's employment policies were unlawful. Apple has kept going, telling me not to talk about safety and not to talk to my coworkers about safety or work conditions or retaliation or anything, right? And I'm like, this is not right. And then they fire me. It's not the reason they fired me. They fired me because I reported them to the federal government a bunch and California government a bunch, but they claim they fired me for reporting and complaining about their surveillance of employees and coercive biometrics harvesting, and said like they can fire an employee for protesting that, and like pointed to an image I shared that was taken like a surveillance camera built into my iPhone of me in my home without me knowing. And they said they fired me for sharing that image. And so I'm like, your policies are jacked. Like they are not, this is not, you can't do this. And Apple had prided itself forever of being like the most secretive company in the world and openly saying, if you share anything we don't like, we'll fire you. And so I told the NLRB, I'm like, I don't think that's legal. And shortly after I was fired, Tim Cook sent an email to all Apple staff complaining that someone had leaked very confidential details of an internal meeting, and he was very upset. Those details were like that he was talking about pay equity between genders. He was talking about benefits, COVID safety protocols, and said they're going to do everything in their power to find out who leaked all those work conditions, and they don't belong at Apple. Anyone who leaks work conditions don't belong at Apple. So I sent that to NLRB too, and they're like, that's also unlawful, you know? So they agreed with me on that, but it's taking forever on the retaliation cases. California hasn't even started. They said they're like still 4 years out to even start, which California. And then US Department of Labor, I went through the same agency that Matt did. They have like 25 federal statutes they oversee. And they've just been openly retaliating against me from the beginning, which has been very exhausting. And I did not know that's been their long-standing reputation, actually, like going back in the Government Accountability Office reports back to like the 80s and 90s. This has just always been their jam, that this US Department of Labor whistleblower protection program is captured by business interests, and they try to make whistleblowers go away and like give up, withdraw. And the findings of merit on whistleblower retaliation charges are dismal. And it shouldn't be that hard, because what you're like, someone did something protected, they were fired or demoted or suspended or whatever, and it seems like it's related. But I looked up the railroad ones, it was like 0.06% ever have a finding of merit, like just numbers that don't make any sense. So this agency goes out of its way to not find merit in anything. NLRB, it sounds like hopefully, supposedly will be soon, but at this point, it's like 2 years later, and as much as I'm going to keep fighting this, it's like it's too late. You know, at this point, they should have cleared my name a long time ago. I can't find a job because it's still out there of like, did Ashley deserve to be fired for complaining about surveillance and reporting them to the federal government? I don't know. The government hasn't weighed in. You know, when it takes forever like that, it really makes it difficult for people to try to get on with their lives while they're trying to fight these cases. So I've been very frustrated with that as well. And it's like, who's going to come forward after me when I have the EPA trying to cover up for Apple? I have the US Department of Labor retaliating against me, trying to get me to withdraw my charges. The NLRB is taking forever. You know, no one came to help. No one's protecting me. So it's like, we have laws on the books, but if they're not enforced, do we even have them? Do I have labor protections? I don't feel like it today. So I've been very critical of those agencies, and I've let them know along the way of areas I think they can improve with this. I think it's really, it explains a lot about, I think, the US society, that these agencies aren't functional. If workers could actually go and report issues and have them dealt with, we'd have a lot of stuff dealt with. A lot of systemic issues might actually be addressed. But I think when nothing is addressed and people are just silenced, that kind of explains how we just have corporations running our country.
That seems to be the case. Matt, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just simply that justice delayed is justice denied, and you're learning that. And that's how I felt when I went to OSHA and I had to hire an attorney. I had to hire a law firm. So it's very common. It's so detrimental to the voice of the working class that everything is so slow. Arbitration takes forever. You know, these agencies, captured is a great word.
Ray, why don't you start? We're going to talk
Okay.
about this point.
For the last two speakers, one, my father's family is from Ohio, and my dad was the first African-American male born in Kent. And unfortunately, my uncle sold property to the University of Kent as well. And I really, to look on television and see the fish floating down the river and have EPA sit up and say it's okay, you just, given my over 12 years working on the shipyard at Hunters Point, EPA has the lowest standards and common denominator. The state of California had higher standards than the federal government. And both of your former speakers are 100% correct in terms of the lack of protection that these regulatory agencies provide the population. I have been very fortunate that I had some outstanding academic scientific scholars working with me that had integrity and didn't sell their soul for $1. And that, unfortunately, on one of these last projects that I'm stepping down, unfortunately, from, is that we're discovering radioactive isotopes in the residence of Bayview Hunters Point from the naval shipyard, because plutonium is developed when you blow up a bomb. It is not a natural occurring element in the environment. And yet they try and give this BS line to the general public saying, oh, yet no. And that I won't name the medical institution, but they have workers out there and on the shipyard, and all of the workers have tested for radioisotopes. I have done step out measurements for the air district we did on exposure and for VOCs, as well as then working on that for this other project I was chair of the board for a while, in terms of how far out is the radiation in your air pattern. So, and for the young lady with this vapors that are coming from underground, they need to do a vapor extraction methodology and finding out where the crap is at underground and do an extraction method, because vapors extraction will take forever and ever, but you want to get to the damn source and what's causing this and where this pollution is at to deal with removal. And we live in California, so cement is going to crack. And that is something that we have to be vigilant over in terms of the risk factor. And it's sad, the gentleman said from Ohio said he had to go get an attorneys. The residents who bought that Leonard property did an out-of-court settlement, unfortunately, for radiation exposure, and they only settled for $7 million. In the state of California, I was in the meeting and I kind of lost it a little bit. And they're saying they did a surface scan for radiation, but the equipment they used only covers 6 to 12 inches of the topsoil. In San Francisco, you got to dig down 3 feet deep for your sewage pipe. So what plumber is want to go on potential radioactive soil to clean up your leak when your poop is going down the street? It ain't happening. You know, it's sad, but all we have is each other in this fight. We need to work together and do an accumulative buildup of knowledge and look for those men and women of integrity that haven't sold their soul out to the corporate, because unfortunately our regulatory agencies, which I agree with the other two presenters, you just got to shake your head. And each time we look and we see the Clean Air Act and water is being chopped down from what was said in the 70s, and you have to laugh when you think Nixon established the EPA. And it breaks your heart is the kindest words I could put out here in terms of the lack of ethics that is practiced in science. And they play on the ignorance of the community, and that we as a community, and I've been lucky since I've been in academia to find those men and women who are willing to speak up and not sell their soul or compromise their scientific principles for the truth. That is what we're looking for, because many of these things that we are talking about are preventable. People don't have to. But then when you deal with the long-range health effects from this exposure, is a whole nother issue. that they don't want to deal with. But if lawyers are brought in and independent scientists and toxicologists to deal with, you were exposed to this, then what are the diseases that are associated? Like in Bayview, I just finished a 20-year study, Dr. Palmer and I, of benzene exposure, and the level that we measured at the cancer rate at 100,000 was 578% above EPA standards. This I can document in records and measurements for the last 20 years. The Air District never measured it. I'm the first. And some of the sources of pollution was 50 feet away from a child care center. So you can imagine what the children are. When I went to Carver Elementary School and I grabbed the little gifted children, Black children, and made them my research assistants back in '98, 55% of the babies were asthmatic. I go back 10 years later because the principal went to San Francisco State with us, Steve, and 85% of the babies are asthmatic. It's not gotten better, it's worse. I sit on the health department Southeast Advisory Clinic, and for 28 years, and the breast cancer, at one point when Dr. Gillis did her work, Debbie Gillis did excellent work, and that the African-American women had the highest breast cancer rate in the world. And it was my generation, the baby boomers, that were suffering this level because of their fathers were recruited from down south and they stuck them carrying the radioactive animals, because the job there at Hunters Point was to make a determination. What kills you quicker, uranium-235 or plutonium? They radiated the animals. They then had the men carry about a mile over to what is now known as the Superfund site. The Black workers, which I had the privilege in '98 of listening to one of the few survivors at our board meeting, called it the pit. It was nothing but a hole. And all this crap is leaking into the bay. And please don't eat any fish out of the bay, period. All of that over there, what they call parcel F in the bay between Double Rock, Candlestick, and the state park is all radioactive. It is all radioactive. The underground fire that took place in the Superfund site in 2018, August 2018, burned for 105 days underground. The surface fire was put out in 6 hours, but they didn't do any measurements for air pollution until 22 days to 27 days after the surface fire. And they had to tell me to be quiet in a restaurant when I was reviewing the literature with a couple other colleagues, because I'm looking at these elevated rates of these chemicals coming out of the ground. And these clowns are pretending that, oh, everything is okay. No, I did read and I did study out of state and learn chemistry and science. I taught 5 years at UC Berkeley, environmental chemistry and engineering. I do know my subject matter, even though I happen to be of African descent. And it just pisses you off, to be kind. When I'm overseas, I'm treated like a human being. Brother, can you help us? Can you do this? When I came back and dealt with the Navy, I'm being challenged. Are you really a college professor because I don't buck dance or wear a bow tie? I'm not here to play these games. These are my friends and neighbors I grew up with. I'm demanding the highest standards possible to be employed to save their lives. They deserve a clean breath of air. They deserve a clean glass of water, period. And if you can't do that, you need to stay away from me, even though I have gray hair. I haven't lost my soul or my integrity, and I've been blessed with other colleagues who have the same beliefs and haven't sold their soul for $1 or a penny. And I'm sorry, they have some Negro leaders out there in the community that they seek, that the corporations seek out, like Leonard and others. And we even caught under Freedom of Information Act, where EPA's regulator and Leonard was conspiring together through emails to tell the board a bunch of BS. And I'm always bringing up, and I have 4 different scholars to come up work with me in different disciplines, of physicists who is licensed to handle Superfund sites, a geologist to deal with land and movement, and one of the nation's analytical chemists who did the analysis for NASA on the Soviet space station before any American astronauts went on board. And it's that equipment that we used in Bayview, cutting edge, so that they never sold their souls. And I'm so grateful to them. At least we got part of the truth out, and we're stepping down, and we're hoping that the next generation will step up and take our places in this struggle, because it's not going to go away. The corporate interest is so binding. And I was disappointed in Obama. He gave lip service, but didn't follow through. And Biden has done the same thing. I have not seen any real changes in EPA's practices as it comes for these highly exposed communities. If you look at COVID and the impact in Louisiana, and they said, oh, the trigger was the Mardi Gras. That's a bunch of BS. What happened is down what they call Cancer Alley, where they have the large population of African Americans. 70% of all deaths during the first phase of COVID were African Americans. They weren't in New Orleans celebrating at Mardi Gras. It is from the chemical exposure. And that part of my piece that I was working with the state on is genetic variances and increased susceptibility. And that's what African Americans are suffering, because the medical model in EPA, and this is the butt kicker, is a 35-year-old white male for chemical exposure. The original breast cancer studies done in the United States were done on white males, not even white women. And you just say, my God, we need real science to be practiced in this nation to protect the population. So thank you. This is a long time. I thank you for giving me the time to express this. It's just that you and I haven't gone to school. I've been at this since 1970, and I will continue to go forward in this. And hopefully some of my students have gone on and got their doctorates and MDs to further our efforts in trying to bring out the truth and a better quality of life for all the citizens in the United States and in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
And one of the things is the politicians, Senator Feinstein, Senator Boxer, and these politicians have known about this. Nancy Pelosi, they've all known about this. And
their families, Steve, Mary Radcliffe in the Bayview newspaper, who's an attorney, unfortunately she's ill now, did an outstanding research investigation and showed that all of those politicians you just mentioned have financial ties with the development of the shipyard out there, and to look the other way. Just in Hunters Point, there are over 100 brownfield sites. That's where companies abandon the lots. And as the young lady said, they build on top of these polluted sites. And it's like, hey, nobody knows, let's go make the money. Just like on Mariners Village was the Navy's nuclear research facility during the Manhattan Project. Mariners Village was never screened for gamma rays. My in-law, one of my in-laws, lost both of her breasts. Her sister that lived by Candlestick lost her breasts. My niece who lived with her mom, thankfully the chemotherapy has put the cancer in remission. But these are facts that I see all the time working at the clinic and part of the advisory board. And we don't have one physician there that knows a damn thing about environmental medicine. So you're treating the symptoms and you don't have a clue about the cause, nor the people who live there. You're just saying, oh, at least one intern called me. I got a ticket for talking on my cell phone and trying to explain to him about our death rate and the susceptibility, and where the man lived at was right next to a high source of benzene, which is a trigger for his asthma. And the rest of you, don't treat him with the inhaler, get him over to general and start to look for some of the symptoms sound like he had early stages of cancer. And at least he called, and the cop didn't show up, so I didn't have to pay that $165 ticket. But it was important to try and save this man's life. And I'm glad the young man called me and saw the need after he had read the report that we put out. I have hope for the next generation to take it further. You know, it's like, for me, it's the fourth quarter of a football game, and I'm old and I'm tired. Take over.
Okay.
And I'm rooting for the next team.
Well, we have our last speaker is also related to Hunter's Point, because unbeknownst to many, the University of California built a animal testing center.
Yep.
And Stella Miranda, who is our next panelist, husband worked at that center and was contaminated and has been struggling for her health and safety and her family's health and safety. So welcome, Stella.
Thank you for inviting me. I just want to say that it's been very frustrating because UCSF doesn't want to take accountability for everything that's going on. They still have that facility open, and there are still 30 to 40 employees out there. You're talking about a Nobel Prize winner that should have pulled all of his employees off of that property, knowing the dangers that are out there. It's very frustrating to work and try to get around getting information from them. It took me a year to get my records request filled. They kept giving me the pandemic issue. They kept giving me all these excuses why they couldn't get the report to me. And their report, again, like the doctor said, it was all superficial ground. They didn't do in-depth dirt findings. There is methane gas. These workers had no clue at all that they were working 25 feet away from E2, where there's a lot of contamination. There's methane running under the building 830 out there. And no one has done anything to clear these people out of there and put them in a safety area where they won't be in danger. It's very frustrating that no one cares or seems to care. And then they send you to their doctors at UCSF, which basically do routine tests, and they tell you, oh, it's okay. It's low levels of contamination. It's not going to affect you in any way. Which, how can you explain that 16 of their employees, 16 out of those 45, all have different radioactive isotopes in their body? No one wants to take any kind of accountability at all. It's very frustrating. And then you go to Kaiser and they're all connected because Kaiser works with UCSF and some of their doctors work for each other. And so they won't give any kind of reports, or they won't get involved. They don't want to get involved. The first thing that they tell you is, oh, I'm really sorry, but you know, it's asthma. It's all related to asthma. My husband has never had asthma in his life. And he has lung disease, and he has right side heart failure as a result. And no one wants to take accountability for that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the issues is the unions, because your husband is a member of AFSCME, American Local 3299. You have
Correct.
You have UPD members, CWA UPD members at UC who are working there. these unions, knowing that their members are getting contaminated, have never made that a political issue, have never made a demands on the UC regents and Gavin Newsom, who's on the regents. Why are they allowing state employees, public employees, to be contaminated, to be poisoned? Right now, as we speak, they're being poisoned. In fact, the police training site there was exposed as sickening people. They removed them, but the UC is allowed and continuing the regents to contaminate workers at that site. So this utter disregard, and I consider it criminal culpability, knowing that people are being poisoned, being killed, and not solving the problem, not moving them, not taking care of them. You also had to fight for workers' compensation, Stella.
Yes, it took 2 years to get it, and they deemed it as asthma, which, as I stated, my husband's never had asthma in his life. And one doctor told him he had restrictive lung disease and that was causing him the issues. He had hypertensive lungs. I mean, they don't want to take any accountability whatsoever. I did get some of the workers to get UPD on board, and all of a sudden, what happens? They changed the union rep out of the blue one day, and so next thing you know, they dropped the whole case. When you called AFSCME, they just listened, but they didn't get involved either. I was very frustrated with both of these unions.
Steve, may I speak?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm also a Teamster. I got my pension check. I worked for 18 years as a Teamster. Disappointed in them. Please seek out for your husband an environmental toxicologist who then could trace back and order up the correct test for diagnosis to see what's in your husband's body, what's the exposure, and what may have caused, because you can do blood and tissue analysis. And a good toxicologist who understands environment exposures can be of assistance. Most of the times they don't run it. Kaiser, they're only interested in profit, not in prevention medicine. I ran a hospital lab for about two and a half years and got out of it because I wouldn't lie for the surgeon who didn't want to come in and operate on a Latino boxer. You got to say what you're about. So please look for a physician, and they're hard to find. I'm going to tell you, they are hard to find. And with what they're doing now in medicine, it's hard even to find a neurologist or a psychiatrist because of the shortages and how they're messing it up in terms of our care. So look for a good toxicologist to assist you in your medical coverage and help.
Thank you.
And Kaiser, by the way, there's going to be a picket on this coming Thursday from 11 to 1:30 of the Kaiser workers. Kaiser is understaffed. People have to wait a long time for appointments for surgeries, including Stella. These for-profit, really, they call themselves non-profit, but they're profiteering. Die because they don't want to take care of people. Mental health problems. People can't get healthcare appointments, mental health care appointments, and commit suicide. Again, criminal activity by these executives, by these corporations, and yet it's unprosecuted by the politicians. Scott Wiener actually has a bill to prevent getting single payer in California, national health care, that he's supporting with the support of the leadership of the NUHW. So I mean, this is endemic, and unfortunately, even the Labor Council took $500,000 as a grant for education from Lennar. And they never reported.
Did you make a deal with the devil?
So yeah, the San Francisco Labor Council took $500,000 from Lennar. Well, guess what? I mean, everything's fine.
By the politicians. Steve, one of the quick for Kaiser, and in that, a colleague of ours that we went to school with this state, Dr. Tasco, she was fired from Kaiser when she was working in Oakland for spending too much time with the patients. They had it on a clock for 6 minutes and 50 seconds. That's enough to give a bottle, go pee in the closet, come back and say goodbye, and here's a pill. She sued them. Her husband was an attorney, and they had to pay because Ramona's a brilliant physician. But that's what doctors are under, the pressure of the corporate pressure and corporate medicine. That's I'll put a kind word to it rather than we're on television, so I'm not going to use my descriptive language. But it is unfortunately cutting our lives short, and we have to be our own advocates for our health and our care. When I was with Rafiki Wellness, that's what I did for residents in Bayview, is write a booklet and lay out areas where you were working at and what chemicals, so that the doctors can at least know, and you could demand, do the blood workup to see what are the diseases associated with this exposure. And that's what I wish it was better, but it's not.
With private healthcare or nonprofits, when you get sick from an industrial disease or from a toxic dump site, they don't do an analysis of where you live and how the relationship, causality of your illnesses. And I interviewed a woman who was in Rodeo next to the refinery there, and Conoco refinery. She had 5 different kinds of cancers, and when she went, and she was a young woman in her late 20s, had 3 kids, and they would not do any kind of investigation of where she got her sickness, because they want to limit the liability of these corporations that are polluting. So they ask those questions. There's no survey. There could be a state law requiring that people that they take a survey of where people have lived and the toxics they come in contact with. But that's another reason we need really national health care. So why don't we open it up for discussion, comments? Okay, Bernie, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you, comrades. And we all agree and have worked together in the past, as you well know. I want you to be in possession of a report of the civil grand jury, which you can get from the Association of Legal Professionals. I'm sure you're aware of them.
San Francisco Civil Grand Jury.
It's
There
right.
you go.
We're
Okay.
dealing with Hunters Point and Treasure
Yes.
Island, as you well know. At this moment, as we speak, London Breed is putting unaffordable housing on Treasure Island, where young kids, mostly Black, die. In effect, the government is complicit. At this point, our good, in effect, Nancy Pelosi, who I well know from many years with Baltimore, if you like, withdrew the $43 million that was put up to deal with this issue. And the fact is, she doesn't put it back, and people are dying there. Okay, the Association of Legal Professionals, I think we gave you the phone number for that. These are active legal people who are now fighting the fight and going to court. That's part of the dealing with these things. Everything that has been said here is absolutely true. And I want you, as you well know, I put my life on the line on this.
And I have to agree with the gentleman about Treasure Island. I had a secret meeting with the residents with one of the reporters, and I saw the 10-year-old girl who was bald-headed because she was playing in the dirt, and they took her over to California Pacific, that's now Sutter, and the radiologist said the baby suffered from radiation poisoning, not knowing, but just making a medical diagnosis. So, brother, you're 100% right.
Gladys is the person to talk to about that.
Bernie and I took a tour of Treasure Island with Carol Harvey, who is
Yes, that's the reporter.
who has
Yes.
been studying Treasure Island for quite a few years.
Yes.
She's an elder, and she still goes out there, and she's made friends with many of the people that live in the naval housing that's now occupied, I guess, it's sort of
Yes.
operated as public housing. And she has found just at what you said about astounding mortality rates. And when we were
Oh.
out there, she talked about the children who were told not to ever play in the dirt. And we walked past a place where the children were playing in the dirt. You know, little
The
4 and
grass.
5-year-olds playing in dirt. That's what,
That's
kids that-
radioactive.
and we thought that
Yes.
it's just so harmful and no one is stopping that.
Well,
Yes.
the government, the Governor Newsom, state agencies, Department of Pesticides and Health, Environment, these agencies allow this. They're moving a lot of earth for the construction projects. It's dust, it's in the air. People are getting contaminated, the workers and the community, and there's a charter school out there next to a dump site. So it's actually criminal activity. But I think what we have in this country is we have the criminals running the system, the government. And people are criminals, and they're engaged in criminal activity, and the corruption, rampant corruption in San Francisco is part of that. PUC, all these agencies, Department of Public Works. One of the things, there's going to be an election next year for mayor, and there should be a candidate to raise these issues on a programmatic basis, because they have to be raised. People should not be dying from radioactive isotopes in their body that they're getting in San Francisco. This is, starting in East Palestine to Silicon Valley, where people are getting sick, now to Hunters Point and Treasure Island, where people are getting contaminated. It shows a systemic problem, and it also shows, again, the failure of the unions, which should be defending the workers, to take up a fight with the politicians, with the Democrats, and because they are in bed with them. And at the University of California, as Stella has said, why isn't AFSCME $32.99? The leader of that, Catherine Lieberger, she's the president of it. It's a statewide local. They're negotiating for a $25 an hour wage, but she's president of the California Federation of Labor. UPD is a statewide local of the CWA. These unions should be making this a political issue. They should be demanding justice for their members. That's what unions should be doing. It's their members that they are required, and their families of the members that they're required to protect. They're not doing it. And I think that's why the politicians have had a free hand to ignore these flagrant violations of the law, of environmental protection. And that's why they're getting worse, actually. So these
in the media not covering it. There's very few reporters and journalists who will cover it. God bless Carol Harvey. She's been on Treasure Island for like 10 years now. She won't let it go.
I love
Well, even in the case,
agree.
Ashley, one of the big cover-ups is, guess what? There's coverage of Ashley in Europe, European newspapers about
I'm
what
big in France and Germany, but not San Francisco.
the San Francisco Chronicle has been approached to do an article on her case. What happened in Ashley? Not a word.
Not a word.
It's like
The San Jose Mercury, not a word.
They did one when I was fired and said Ashley Gjøvik fired for leaking.
okay. And I have to say, Carol Harvey, I agree with you. She's been added. And she's the one that brought me over there. And it's this pollution they took from Hunters Point and dumped it and used it for landfill. Part of the facilities over there in Hunters Point was to train destroyers and nuclear destroyers and the crew for emergency release. And so there is pollution, radiation pollution throughout the base. Throughout. The only television station that gave us any play in Hunters Point when we stopped Leonard from blowing up the football stadium was Channel 11. And they, NBC Investigates. They did, and they.
That was Willie Brown behind Lennar.
Oh, heck yeah. With making 1.2 million a year, I think so.
Yeah.
And selling green cards to Chinese to invest in condos.
I saw them. Look at Steve. I was up there on the hill when what was the African from Liberia was given the tour. Bonner, Kofi Bonner was given a tour to the Chinese And I was up there. And of course, I had to go mess with him. Hey, man, I need to talk to you afterwards. Okay. And he ducked my butt.
The people's tour after.
So, you know, you just gotta say, yes, they are definitely in bed. But I do have to, NBC News in San Jose did a good investigation.
Well, I want to thank you all.
Thank you.
Solidarity, brothers and sisters, keep up the fight. So thank you for joining us on this, I would say, rich discussion about what's going on with toxic waste workers and communities. So thanks for joining us tonight.